The day they fired me, I was 30 minutes away from closing a $65 million deal. Not 30 days. Not 30 weeks. 30 minutes. The TechFlow acquisition had consumed 7 months of my life. 7 months of conference calls that bled past midnight. 7 months of calming panicked executives. Rewriting disclosure language. Catching regulatory traps buried inside exhibits nobody else had bothered to read. And making sure that when everyone sat down to sign, there were no surprises waiting inside the fine print that could unravel everything. I was 49 years old. My name was Daniel Morrison. And for 24 years, I had been the attorney that Caldwell and Partners called when a deal was too complicated, too sensitive, or too expensive to get wrong. I did not give speeches about disruption. I did not walk conference rooms talking about digital transformation or generational alignment or whatever phrase was trending on Business LinkedIn that week. I read contracts. I tracked regulatory changes. I stayed on the phone until problems became solutions. And on that Friday, 30 minutes before everything was supposed to conclude, Bryce Caldwell looked me in the eye and fired me. Not because I had failed. Not because the client had lost confidence in me. Not because there was a performance issue, a missed deadline, a legal error, or even a personality conflict that had finally reached a breaking point. He fired me because his girlfriend wanted my job. I want you to sit with that for a second. 30 minutes before a $65 million transaction closed, the 32-year-old son of the firm's founder decided that the woman he was dating, a woman who had once asked a paralegal to explain what due diligence meant, should take the chair that I had occupied for almost a quarter of a century. I have thought about that moment many times in the months that followed. And the more I thought about it, the more I understood something important. Bryce did not make a business decision that day. He made a catastrophic miscalculation. And the difference between those two things was about to cost him everything. Let me take you back to the beginning. Because what happened to me did not start on that Friday. It started 9 weeks earlier, when Bryce Caldwell was installed as Chief Operating Officer in what the firm's internal memo called a strategic leadership transition. Everyone who had been at Caldwell longer than 3 years understood what that actually meant. Harold Caldwell, the man who had built the firm from a 2-person practice into one of Chicago's most respected corporate law offices over 48 years, was stepping back. Think. He was not sick. He was not forced out. He was simply tired. Tired of the hours. Tired of the politics. And possibly tired of realizing that the industry he had built his life around had become something he no longer fully recognized. So he handed the keys to his son. I had met Bryce maybe 4 or 5 times in all my years at the firm. Brief hallway moments. A holiday party once. A partner lunch where he had pulled out his phone within the first 10 minutes and kept it out for the rest of the meal. He was not unpleasant. He was not stupid. But he was the kind of person who believed that having authority and understanding what it required were the same thing. They are not. When Bryce walked into that building with the title of Chief Operating Officer, the first thing he did was change the aesthetic. The old law books disappeared from the lobby. The framed case certificates came down from the walls. The mahogany furniture, imported from Germany decades ago by Harold's father, stayed. But everything else was replaced with motivational posters, standing desks, and the kind of decor that communicates ambition to people who have never actually had to deliver anything. The second thing he did was bring in Taylor. Her official title was Client Experience Strategist. If you are wondering what that means inside a corporate law firm, you are not alone. As far as anyone could determine, it meant posting photographs of the office on social media and sending internal emails about making the firm's communications feel warmer. Within 2 weeks of arriving, she had asked one of our senior paralegals, a woman who had worked in M&A compliance for 11 years, what due diligence meant. The paralegal came to me afterward with a look I cannot fully describe. I told her not to worry about it. I should have recognized that moment for exactly what it was. That was the morning I saw the first domino lean. The Friday it happened started like every other closing day. I was at my desk before 7, coffee cooling beside my keyboard, which was a habit so consistent that my assistant had stopped offering to reheat it years ago. I was going through the TechFlow documents for what must have been the 40th review. Not because I doubted the work, because I knew what was at stake. 2 days earlier, I had sat across from Patricia Wells at the Union League Club, over salmon and black coffee, and she had said something I still think about. She looked at me and said, "Dan, most lawyers treat us like a file number. You actually understand our business." Patricia was not the kind of person who gave compliments casually. She had run companies, survived hostile negotiations, and fired executives who mistook confidence for competence. When she said something like that, she meant it. At the time, I filed it away as a professional observation. By 4:15 that afternoon, I understood it was the thing that would save my career. The email from Bryce arrived with no context. Just a subject line: "Please come to my office immediately." I read it once. Then I saved a copy to my personal laptop. Not because I knew what was coming. Because 24 years in corporate law trains you to document things that feel off before you understand why they feel off. When I walked into his office, the transformation was complete. The old law books were gone. His grandfather's framed certificates had been replaced with 3 large motivational prints about embracing change. His designer sneakers rested on the mahogany desk like a flag planted in conquered territory. Taylor sat in the corner. Her laptop was open. Instagram was reflected on her screen. Bryce did not look up when I entered. He said, "Sit." That was all. And in that small moment, before a single serious word had been spoken, I understood exactly what kind of conversation this was going to be. He started talking about trajectory. He used words like agile and innovation-driven and generational alignment. He talked about the firm entering a new phase. He talked about needing people who understood digital evolution, whatever that was supposed to mean inside a law practice, where clients paid hundreds of dollars an hour for legal judgment. Not digital anything. I let him talk. When there was finally a pause, I asked directly, "Is this about TechFlow?" He waved his hand like I had mentioned, a minor scheduling inconvenience. "This is not about one deal," he said. But it was about one deal. It was about all the deals. It was about the fact that people like Bryce had been protected their entire careers by people like me. And they had mistaken that protection for weakness, for replaceability, for something they could discard when something shinier came along. For the record, my work history at Caldwell was not subtle. 6 consecutive years of billing more hours than any non-partner in the firm. A 94% client retention rate across my portfolio. The previous year alone, I had brought in $8 million in new business, including 3 Fortune 100 companies that had never worked with Caldwell before. I had personally prevented 2 merger collapses, 1 securities investigation, and 1 situation involving a disclosure that, if filed incorrectly, would have triggered an 8-figure regulatory exposure. None of that was mentioned in Bryce's office. He slid a packet across the desk. "Today is your last day," he said. "Taylor will handle the transition," he said. I looked at Taylor. She was smiling. It was not a nervous smile. It was not an awkward smile. It was the settled, anticipating smile of someone who had been promised the office before the previous occupant had left the building. I said what needed to be said. She is not licensed to practice law. She cannot advise clients. She cannot manage transactions. She does not know the file. Bryce's face hardened. "That is no longer your concern," he said. Taylor closed her laptop halfway and looked at me directly for the first time. "You have 1 hour to clear your office," she said. "Security will escort you. And Daniel, the NDA is non-negotiable. If you discuss client matters, proprietary information, or internal decisions with anyone outside this firm, the firm will respond aggressively." There was the threat. Clean and precise. Delivered before I had even stood up. They did not just want to fire me. They wanted to seal me off completely. Make me feel small enough and scared enough that I would take the 7 months of severance. sign the agreement, and vanish. I stood slowly. Not because I was afraid, because if I moved too quickly, I might say everything that deserved to be said in a room where it could be used against me. I thought about Patricia Wells. I thought about the tech flow board sitting somewhere across the city, waiting for a clean closing. I thought about 35 clients with my personal phone number because, when something truly mattered, they did not want to call a receptionist. They wanted a person who understood their business. Then I looked at Bryce one final time. He was already checking his phone. 24 years of loyalty had been reduced to a cardboard box and an escort to the elevator. But as I turned toward the door, one thought settled into the space where the shock should have been. They had the office. They had the letterhead. They had the marble lobby and the name above the door. But they did not have the trust. And they were about to learn how expensive that difference could be. I sat in my home office that night, still wearing the same suit. The boxes were stacked against the wall. My tie was loose. The coffee I had poured an hour earlier was already cold. Outside, Chicago was moving into Friday night. But inside that room, time felt suspended somewhere between disbelief and purpose. For a few minutes, I did nothing. I just let the silence sit there. And then it shifted. The shock faded. Something sharper came up underneath it. Not anger. Clarity. I opened my personal laptop and created a document. The title was simple: What I Still Have. It was not emotional. It was not a revenge fantasy. It was inventory. 24 years in corporate law will teach you this above almost everything else before you make a move. You account for your assets, your liabilities, and your leverage. What did Caldwell have? The building. The branding. Harold Caldwell's name on the wall. A COO who thought legal complexity could be replaced with a new tone of voice, and a client experience strategist who did not understand the documents she would now be responsible for. What did I have? First, my systems. Over 2 decades, I had developed my own frameworks for M&A transaction management, SEC compliance review, regulatory update tracking, and due diligence risk assessment. These were not built using firm resources. They were not on Caldwell servers. They were built in my own time, refined through hundreds of engagements, stored in my personal cloud, and referenced by nobody at the firm because nobody at the firm had ever asked where the results were coming from. They simply expected the results. Second, my relationships. Patricia Wells, Sarah Rodriguez, Sarah, Jim Thompson, general counsels, CFOs, board members, people who had my personal cell number because the firm's official response system took 4 days to return a call. These were not acquaintances. These were people I had helped through crises. People who called me at midnight when a deal was collapsing and needed a real answer. Not a holding statement. That kind of trust is not transferred by email. It is not reassigned when someone new gets a title. It either follows the person who earned it, or it disappears, looking for somewhere else to go. Third, my network. The Chicago M&A Bar Association, the monthly breakfast group at Riverside Golf Club, the annual securities law conference where I had delivered remarks for 7 consecutive years. Senior attorneys across the Midwest who had watched me work, understood what I could do, and would not be confused for 1 second about what it meant that I was suddenly available. Now the NDA. I read it again carefully. 7 months of severance in exchange for silence. Non-compete clause that was broader than it should have been. Bryce probably believed the money would convince me to disappear quietly. But I knew Illinois employment law better than the associate who had drafted that clause on short notice. A non-compete clause does not function as a permanent barrier. It functions as a speed limit. And in situations involving termination without cause, particularly termination under circumstances that could be characterized as bad faith, the enforceability narrows considerably. More importantly, I was not planning to attack Caldwell. I was not going to call clients. I was not going to discuss firm business. I was not going to create a social media post about what Bryce had done. I was not going to perform outrage for an audience. I was going to wait. Because the worst thing you can do when reckless people are building their own disaster is interrupt them before it reaches full size. I gave myself 30 days. 30 days of silence. 30 days of careful, disciplined restraint that I would not allow anyone, including myself, to compromise. On Monday morning, the first message came from Tony, a senior associate who had worked under my supervision for 6 years. He texted emergency partners meeting this morning. Bryce announced Taylor will transition into senior legal coordinator role. This is insane. I stared at that message for a long time. Senior legal coordinator. A woman who had needed the phrase due diligence explained to her was now being handed formal authority over complex corporate transactions, regulatory compliance filings, and clients with tens of millions of dollars in play. I did not reply. I needed Tony to keep his position. I needed the people still inside Caldwell to stay where they were until the picture became clear. Responding would pull him toward a decision he was not ready to make. So I watched, and from a distance, the watching was enough. The first public signal came at the Chicago M&A Bar Association meeting that Tuesday. I walked into the Standard Club dining room, expecting polite curiosity. What I found was something closer to professional radar working in real time. 47 of the most experienced corporate attorneys in Illinois. Men and women who had built careers on reading situations without being told what to look for. Jim Harrison reached me first. He shook my hand a little too firmly and said, "Dan Morrison, heard you have some big news." I smiled and said what I had decided to say all week. Exploring new opportunities. That phrase did exactly what I needed it to do. Nothing more. No accusation. No names. No bitterness dressed up as professional dignity. Just enough room for everyone in that dining room to draw their own conclusions. In our world, composure speaks louder than almost anything else. If I had walked in angry, I would have looked like someone who had been defeated. If I had attacked Caldwell publicly, I would have looked dangerous, unstable, someone to avoid. But by staying steady, by saying nothing inflammatory while making clear I was available and unfazed, I let the attorneys in that room do what attorneys always do. They asked questions. They made calls. They talked to each other. By Saturday morning at Riverside Golf Club, the conversation had already moved from curiosity to logistics. Jim Coleman from Foster & Associates pulled me aside at the 7th tee and kept his voice low. "Dan, I've got clients asking if you're available for project work. Regulatory compliance. M&A review. Nothing that would conflict with your agreements." Obviously. I looked down the fairway for a moment. Then I said I'm being careful. But eventually, yes, I'll be available for the right work. By the 12th hole, 2 other attorneys in the group had asked the same question. The first crisis call came in week 2, 7:15 in the morning. Sarah Rodriguez from Great Lakes Holdings. Her voice was controlled the way it gets when someone is managing fear carefully. She said, "Dan, I know you can't discuss Caldwell business, but we received a compliance notice from the SEC. Taylor filed what she described as a standard response. Now our outside auditors are telling us the potential fine could be $3.8 million. I closed my eyes. I knew what had happened before she finished explaining. There were new subsidiary reporting requirements that had come out of a recent regulatory update. They were technical. They were easy to miss if you were not actively tracking that area of securities law. And they were the kind of thing that could be misread as routine correspondence if you did not understand what kind of notice actually required specialized handling. I had flagged that exact issue weeks ago inside my own notes. I had flagged it because it was new. Because the stakes were real. And because I had learned over 2 decades that the notices that look routine are sometimes the most dangerous ones. Taylor had treated it like paperwork. I told Sarah carefully, "I cannot advise you on a Caldwell matter. But as a friend, you need specialized securities counsel to review that filing today. Not next week. Today." She said, "It is that bad." I said, "Yes, it is." Within the next 8 days, 7 more calls arrived with variations of the same story. boilerplate language where legal judgment was required, missed regulatory deadlines, misread disclosures. One client received an AI-generated response to a formal legal notice and did not realize it until their general counsel caught the language during a routine review. Another had signed documents with a submission date error that created a gap in their compliance timeline. Every mistake had Bryce's philosophy behind it. Every mistake had Taylor's name on it. And every mistake proved the same thing in the starkest possible terms. They had not fired the problem. They had fired the person who had been quietly preventing the problems all along. By the fourth week, the calls were no longer isolated emergencies. They had become a pattern so consistent that I could almost predict the arc of each conversation before it arrived. The careful opening, the polite acknowledgement that I was in a restricted period, the description of a situation that had somehow gone sideways in the exact way it would go sideways if handled by someone with no relevant experience. The quiet panic underneath the professional language. I kept every call brief. I kept every response within the lines of what was permissible. I did not offer legal advice on active Caldwell matters. I did not reach out first. I did not initiate. I simply answered honestly when people who trusted me reached out and asked what I thought. But the call I had been expecting arrived on a Thursday afternoon. Patricia Wells. I let the phone ring twice before I answered. Not to make her wait, but to remind myself of the one rule I could not afford to break. Do not cross the line. Do not give Bryce something he could use. Patricia said, Dan, I need to ask you something carefully. She described the situation with TechFlow. The acquisition had closed, but during a post-closing audit, her team discovered a regulatory disclosure issue connected to new FTC requirements that had taken effect shortly before signing. Taylor's team had missed it. The potential exposure was $18 million. The exact trap I had flagged in my personal deal notes. The exact provision I had marked in yellow because I knew how new it was, how technical it was, and how quietly devastating it could become if no one caught it before documents were executed. I said, Patricia, I cannot discuss that transaction while Caldwell is still counsel of record. She said, I know. That is why I am not asking you to. I am asking whether, after your restriction period ends, you would be available to review the situation independently. I said I would be willing to discuss a proper engagement after the restriction period ends. With separate counsel involved, and with everything handled properly. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, would Foster and Associates be the kind of firm that could handle something like this? I looked out the window of my home office. Foster and Associates. Jim Foster had been trying to recruit me for 3 years. Not aggressively. Not with competing offers and recruitment pressure. Just quietly. Consistently. In the way people reach out when they respect someone and want them available when the timing is right. Jim ran a boutique corporate practice downtown. Smaller than Caldwell. Less interested in reputation and more interested in results. His firm did not fill lobby walls with motivational art. His attorneys practiced law. I said I think Jim Foster would be very interested in hearing what you need. That sentence was the door. And it had just opened completely. The 30-day mark arrived on a Friday afternoon. At exactly 2 o'clock, I called Jim Foster. He answered on the second ring and said, Dan Morrison. I was wondering when you would finally call. I said I am interested in discussing opportunities. He laughed quietly. He said, opportunities, Dan. Half the city has been asking where you landed. Monday morning. I walked into Foster and Associates for the first time as a potential colleague rather than a visitor. The office was nothing like Caldwell. There was no marble intimidation at the entrance. No glass partition walls designed to make junior associates feel observed. No open-plan landscape where $300 an hour lawyers worked elbow to elbow in the name of collaborative energy. Just closed-door offices. Worn conference tables. Good light. And the unmistakable atmosphere of people who were simply there to do the work. Jim stood when I entered his office. He said I heard what happened. I said I imagine most people have by now. He said, not everyone. Only the ones who matter. Over the next 90 minutes, he laid out a proposal. Senior counsel. Not partner immediately. which avoided unnecessary complications around the non-compete language. A compensation structure that was more than fair. Full malpractice coverage. Full litigation support if Caldwell decided to pursue action. And the freedom to rebuild a practice properly, without someone's Instagram strategy affecting client outcomes. Then Jim leaned back in his chair and said the thing I had been working toward for 30 days. He said Patricia Wells called. So did Sarah Rodriguez. So did Jim Thompson. They are not asking for Caldwell. They are asking for you. I looked at my hands for a moment. 30 days of silence. No threats. No campaigns. No dramatic LinkedIn revelations. No phone calls to warn clients away. No interviews about what Bryce had done or what Taylor did not know. And the truth had traveled faster and further than any of that would have. Jim said something that stayed with me. He said, Dan, Caldwell thinks clients belong to the firm because their name is on the invoice. They are about to learn that clients follow competence. I looked at him. I said, when do I start? He smiled. He said, you already have. The collapse did not come as a single dramatic event. That is not how institutions fail. They do not explode. They decompress. A client stops responding to calls. A board requests outside review. A general counsel asks a competitor for a second opinion. A senior partner starts keeping his office door closed. Then one morning, everyone realizes the structure is still standing. But everything inside it that made the structure worth maintaining is already gone. By the end of the third month, 28 companies had either formally terminated their representation at Caldwell or were in active discussions with Foster & Associates about transition. Not because I reached out, not because I made a case, because they had experienced the difference between my work and what came after it. And the difference was not subtle. Then the malpractice claims began arriving. 19 companies filed notices or formal threats of legal action related to mishandled transactions, compliance failures, and regulatory submissions that had been prepared without the judgment or knowledge those filings required. The numbers attached to those claims were not small. One alone carried potential exposure of $18 million. When the totals were aggregated and the pattern became undeniable, Caldwell's insurance carriers began asking the kind of questions that do not have comfortable answers. By the time news cameras appeared outside the federal courthouse, it was no longer a private professional story. It was a public reckoning. I was reviewing regulatory documents in my office at Foster & Associates, coffee in hand, when my assistant knocked on the door. She said, Mr. Morrison, Channel 7 is asking for a comment. Caldwell and Partners just filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. I set the coffee down. I walked to the conference room and turned on the television. The anchor reported that the 48-year-old firm had lost the majority of its major corporate client base in less than 90 days. Sources familiar with the situation pointed to catastrophic management decisions made by recently installed leadership. The reporter noted that the firm's former lead M&A counsel had been terminated shortly before multiple clients began departing. Then the camera cut to Bryce. He was standing outside the courthouse in a conservative suit that looked like it had been selected by someone managing optics rather than expressing confidence. The designer composure was gone. The sneakers were not in evidence. He looked like a man who had woken up one morning expecting to run something and found instead that the thing he thought he was running had never really been his. Taylor was not there. She had not been seen near the cameras all week. Reporters called questions from every direction. One of them asked whether unlicensed staff had been managing multi-million-dollar transactions. Another asked how he responded to malpractice claims from 19 separate companies. A third asked whether Daniel Morrison's termination shortly before the client departures was directly connected to the firm's collapse. Bryce should have kept walking. He stopped. He said, "This is a coordinated attack by competitors. We made strategic decisions about the future direction of the firm. Strategic decisions." He said it on camera. With that one sentence, he confirmed what every attorney watching already understood. The decisions had been deliberate. The termination had been intentional. And the consequences that followed were the direct result of choices he had made with full awareness. His defense attorneys, standing slightly behind him, looked at each other with the expression of people who had just watched someone work very hard to make their job significantly harder. Jim Foster stood beside me in the conference room. He shook his head slowly and said he just made their case for them. I watched the screen for another moment. Then I turned off the television and went back to work. 6 months later, I stood at the window of my permanent office at Foster & Associates. A cup of coffee in my hand that I had actually remembered to drink while it was warm. The Chicago skyline sat in the late morning light, still and enormous and indifferent to the small stories happening inside the buildings that filled it. I was not rushing. That was the part I kept coming back to. For the first time in years, possibly the first time since Sophie was born, there was no internal clock running. No deal emergency requiring attention at an unusual hour. No Bryce Caldwell in the background turning every professional interaction into a question of who needed to prove something to whom. There was just work. Good work. Honest work. Work that reminded me every day why I had become a lawyer in the first place. By then I was a named partner. 28 former Caldwell clients had moved their engagements to Foster. Not because I had recruited them. And not because anyone had been pressured, but because trust does not transfer when you reassign an account. It either follows the person who built it, or it dissolves in search of somewhere else to land. Tony had joined us 3 weeks after I started. He worked in the office across the hall. Still methodical. Still careful. Still the kind of lawyer who read every paragraph twice because he understood that the sentence nobody else bothered with is often the sentence that costs a client the most. Some mornings, I would walk past his office and see him exactly the way I had always known him. Coffee on one side, yellow legal pad on the other. Head down, doing the work quietly. I thought sometimes about all the people inside Caldwell who had been good at their jobs and never got the recognition because a 32-year-old with a title had confused activity with results. My phone lit up on the desk. Austin. He had texted Dad. Dean's List again. Thanks for showing me that setbacks are part of the story. Not the end of it. I read it twice. Then a third time. For months. I had carried a quiet fear that my children would measure me by what had happened that Friday afternoon. That they would see the cardboard boxes, the security escort, the severance packet on the kitchen counter, and conclude that their father had been beaten by something he could not control. Instead, my son saw the thing I had almost missed myself in the middle of it. Not defeat. Not humiliation. A demonstration that the way you respond to what happens to you matters more than what happened. A few minutes later, another message arrived. Patricia Wells. She wrote, Dan, the board approved our nomination of Foster & Associates for Law Firm of the Year from Chicago Business. You built this. We simply followed. I sat with that for a long time. Then a third message came. This one from the care coordinator at my mother's facility. She wrote, Mr. Morrison, your mother wanted me to pass along that she has been telling everyone here how proud she is of the way you handled your situation with such grace. Grace. That word landed differently than I expected. Because the honest truth is that I had not always felt graceful during those months. There had been nights in that home office when I wanted to call Bryce and deliver every thought I had been suppressing. There had been mornings when I drafted messages I never sent. There had been moments when the anger was loud enough that staying quiet felt less like strategy and more like a discipline I was barely maintaining. But I held the line. Every time. Not because I was certain it would work. Because I understood that the moment I reached for immediate satisfaction, I would be handing Bryce exactly what he needed to make me the problem. So I let competence speak. I let relationships speak. I let the consequences arrive without my fingerprints on them. The old Caldwell building had a tech startup in it now. Every time I drove past and saw the new signage, I felt something that was not quite irony but lived very close to it. Bryce had built his entire leadership philosophy around disruption. In the end, the only thing he successfully disrupted was his own inheritance. I do not think about him with bitterness anymore. I think about him the way you think about a difficult chapter in a book you have already finished. It shaped the story. It served its purpose. And then the story moved forward. Because that is what the story did. Bryce had wanted to replace me. What he actually did was remove me from a building that was already structurally compromised. Before the roof came down, at 49, I did not lose my career. I was released from the place where it had been undervalued. And sometimes, being underestimated by the wrong person is the most useful thing that can happen to you. Because they lower their guard, they stop watching. They assume the outcome before the work is done. And while they are busy celebrating a victory that has not yet been earned, you are quietly building the thing they convinced themselves you no longer had. I was not replaced that Friday afternoon. I was finally free. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment below. Would you have stayed quiet and let the truth unfold the way Daniel did? Or would you have confronted them the moment they handed your career to someone who could not find it on a map? I want to know what you would have done. And if you believe that real competence speaks louder than any title someone hands themselves, subscribe to Alex's Revenge. New stories about betrayal, justice, and the kind of comebacks that actually last. Every single week.